What I would love to do next is actually invite three of our guests up who actually do this on a day-to-day basis. I will introduce our panel here with Luis Enrique Gonzalez, who is the Marketing Knowledge Director for Grupo Bimbo, which owns brands beloved like Hostess, like Entenmann's, like Sara Lee, like Takis, which is new. Rajit Chakravarty from the Coca-Cola company, the Senior Director of Brand Equity, and then Amanda Fraga, who is with us from Mastercard today. So, thank you. Nice to support. Yeah. So, I just want to have a conversation with you, since I know all of you are working through all of this on your own. Tell me about how brand building has changed in each of your own categories in the last 5-10 years. And maybe, Luis Enrique, maybe we start with you. How has brand building changed in your category and in the last?
It's changing a lot. And I would like to take just a few minutes about what Grupo Bimbo is.
Yeah.
Grupo Bimbo is the leader in the bakery industry in the world. We are the largest manufacturer in the bread category, and we have 77 years since Grupo Bimbo was created in Mexico, founded in Mexico City. And during the time, the brand building has been important, but maybe we were dominated by the operational side. And maybe 4 or 5 years ago, our CEO said that his deepest worry was to lose the relevance among consumers. And it put a lot of challenge in my shoulders and in my colleagues within the marketing area, because how we can measure or how we can track the relevance of our brands. And it makes a change. 2 years ago, I had a meeting with Ipsos team, led by Dawa Roadmaker. I remember him very, very profoundly with my recognition to his inspiration. And we don't find too many differences in the things that we are already doing with the framework that you are already sharing, because we are testing that. But it's very important for us to recognize how we are addressing the consumer demands after COVID. And this is part of the most important thing. I think that is related with the context. And we are acting actively in the sustainability, for example. We are acting in the expectations, because the expectation in a CPG comes from the product by itself. And then the expectations comes from other part of the responses that the consumer expect from us. And it's very, very important. We have big steps, but we are far away, and we need to improve and not validate, because the framework for us is validated already. We know that the expectation for the product and the contextual part is tested for us, at least in the pilot, and we are moving ahead with Ipsos and with some other partners. It's not just Ipsos, it's something that Grupo Bimbo is changing significantly.
Amanda, what about you? I imagine for Mastercard, which is an interesting brand, because the card used to be so central to everything you do, and now I'm tapping my phone everywhere, buying stuff everywhere, right, when I never see the card anymore. So tell me about brand building.
Absolutely. Yeah, Mastercard actually about 25 years ago came out with a campaign, if you can remember, called Priceless. And it was all based around the human insight that experiences matter more than things. So when you're using your card, it's about the experiences, the relationships that you're building. That single truth has remained the same. It's based on a human insight, but I love what you shared around context, because the world that we're in has evolved and changed, and our values evolve and change. And so it's not just about experiences and how you spend money, but it's also, what are you doing in the world? What impact are you making? That is really important and central to our brand as well. So that has evolved and changed, and I would say our commitment to that impact has increased more. I also would say, in general, regardless of Mastercard, but brand building, I loved what David shared, because there's the conscious and there's the subconscious decision about choosing a brand, and so I think we're more hyper aware that there's different factors. And so Mastercard thinks being a part of experiences, brand, and what signals are visual, and what are you hearing as well when you finish that transaction and that sound, or you hear it in the commercial as well. So thinking about all those different signals and ways you can engage. So I think that's a really interesting thing that's changed, in the past decade as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Rajit, with a brand as ubiquitous as Coca-Cola, and I know you look after brand equity, which is very, very interesting. Like how has what we've talked about today landed on you? Because brand equity, in my mind, by definition, is something you track consistently over time, right? And as if we're saying that the context, the expectations, all of that is constantly shifting, how have you thought about brand equity in this framework?
Yeah, so one of the things we have learned is just because of the changing nature of brand choices amongst consumers and the changing nature of consumers' lives, static tracking is probably no longer a good idea. So it is one central tool, but you have to almost embellish it with more knowledge and insights around those experiences. We invest a lot in experiences as well, and we recognize that our consumers actually have different types of expectations depending on which brand. And we're talking about 200 different brands within the portfolio of the Coca-Cola company, and in all different market contexts. So context matters to us a lot as well. We find ourselves challenged with tracking context and the consumption context, and that's a really big deal. Whether you're sharing a beverage with a friend or hydrating yourself, you are going to make different choices through different pathways that are available. So it becomes really important to be very holistic in our measurement of equity, but also in service of brand building. Brand building takes a long time. It sometimes takes generations to build some of our biggest brands, and you have to always keep it in that holistic sense and measure every one of those factors.
What about context for you, Amanda? Because I imagine the context determines whether I pull out my phone, pull out a card, Venmo someone, throw down $5 bill.
Right, yeah, no, context matters so much. Matters because industries are changing and competitive sets are changing as well. So your context of who are you measuring yourself against can evolve. We like to think about ourselves as a lifestyle brand. So we have many different audiences, whether it's a B2B decision maker, an issuer merchant, a small business owner that's trying to ensure their transactions go through safely and securely, or consumers, right? We're all very aware of the Mastercard brand, but what is our daily interaction, right? So, thinking about, well, who is the brand that we are today, and who do we want to be in the long term, and building towards that,
Yep.
And thinking about how others might also change, encroach into the competitive set as well, is, I think, a piece of context important to pay attention to.
Let me mention something, Oscar. I'm talking about the context.
Please.
I would like to share that we have operations in Russia and Ukraine. Not branded, but we have operations and we're still producing in Russia and Ukraine. Imagine that context. The second one, Argentina. Argentina, the context, high inflation, maintaining the needs of the consumer, responding to different conditions and providing with our brands solutions for the daily life. US with high inflation, but the consumer asking for us, and when I say quotes, is compare the inflation in Argentina. Over 100% with 8% in the US or in Mexico. But the consumer is demanding differently because functional benefits, social activities, purpose-driven brands, acting accordingly to what is happening. And it's very, very important to remark that context. Two other operations that we already have with very high potential, India or China. In China, we have more than 12 years working there, for 15 years. In India, we are expanding our operations, but the context and the opportunities that we have and the brand landing, Bimbo is already launching Bimbo brand in addition to Harvest Gold, local brand, and we were discussing about the other day about the importance of the local brands, but having the balance, as Rajit said. Maybe Coca-Cola, and I know Coca-Cola because I worked 24 years for Coca-Cola. I know the Coca-Cola omnipresence. But Rajit, I have a news for you. In Mexico, Bimbo is ahead of Coca-Cola in household penetration. And it's very important to understand that context and that expectation of the consumer. And empathy, from the framework, for us is something that we need to check in the communications, in the actions, in the responses to the consumer, and then have the perfect storm to validate our strength. And just something that I forgot to mention, our brands in the US, maybe you hear Grupo Bimbo and you don't, and you said, what is Grupo Bimbo? We have Entenmann's, Thomas, Sara Lee. All of those three brands are over 1 billion retail sales in the US. Very, very important, but the challenge is we have a competitor offering supposedly the same, but the differentiation, the equity, the responses that we give to the consumer. If those brands are not enough, let me use another example, ballpark. If you go to the stadium, the hot dog that you are eating at the stadium is from our buns, ballpark. The importance of the brand and the equity and the responses that we provide to the consumer are crucial.
Rajit, I want to come back to something you said that caused a little bit of a gasp in the audience, where you said static brand tracking is not relevant. Is that what you said, or not?
Well, not sufficient.
That's sufficient. That's better than relevant. How do you think, and how do then this is a good conversation for us over cocktails, those of us that do brand tracking, right? How do you think that needs to evolve given kind of this conversation we're having, and where is that going?
So I can give you a couple of examples of the way we supplement static brand tracking, let's say. So when we do traditional brand tracking, it is in the context of the competition, and we have, let's say, a competitive set, a set of markets, and year-round tracking, and we mostly get at brand perceptions. So there are a couple of ways that we have supplemented that information. One is to link it with consumption diaries, and that's work that Ipsos has also been involved in. But essentially, track brand equity with a set of consumers, get a subset of them to complete consumption diary. Yeah. So in the consumption diary, you would get the consumption context, who they were with, what were they doing, what kind of choices, away from home, out of home, whatever, and then you can even get as deep as the reasons why they made the choice of the brand that they did. And you could well end up with somebody that's drinking let's say, a Sprite instead of a Coca-Cola, which is their favorite brand according to brand tracking. That's because the context is different, and that maybe they were thirsty, or maybe they were with their friends or whatever, and they made a different brand choice than their most loved brand. So that's one context. And the other way in which we supplement static tracking is let's not just do surveys and collect data and ask consumers, but also let's go to where the consumer already is. On the digital, on social media, on product reviews, there's a lot of ambient data that's sitting there that can be mined for gaining the same kinds of insights to supplement what people are saying in tracking surveys. Yeah, those are a couple of examples.
It certainly doesn't make it any easier, but I think it makes it much more realistic, and it makes it much more actionable in terms of like what we need to do as brands, right? So we've spent a little bit of time talking about context. I want to talk about expectations a little bit, right? I think, Luis Enrique, you have some brands that obviously I'm looking at a Twinkie, I have certain expectations of the brand, right? How do you think about expectations, and how do you go about shaping that for your category? And then Amanda, I'm going to talk about payments, which is perhaps more even complicated.
Covering the consumer expectations, the origin is from the roots, is from the product by itself. And we are very, very consciousness about the recipes, the ingredients, the expectations of the consumer about what the product should be, and then the brand communication, and then how the brand is really satisfying those expectations and those requirements, because it's very dynamic. It was in the old times, it was enough to be there. No, I remember the availability, accessibility, and affordability as the principles from the Coca-Cola company in the 80s. But right now, it's not enough to have those. No, it is necessary to track different things, and the expectations. Sorry for being repetitive, but the expectations are bigger than the traditional expectation. The functional benefits, the category, the competitiveness that we could have within the category is something that we need to differentiate. And within Grupo Bimbo, we have identified different capabilities that we need to move in order to have the desired result. And we define capability as something that could provide us differentiation or competitive advantage in the consumer eyes. Mm-hmm. And this is something that we have related with expectations. Sure. How we are responding in a different way and according to the new requirements. Different ways of doing that. No, it's not just sliced bread. We have very, very good examples in sub-brands or brands like Artesano is under Sara Lee here in the US, or 00, who is responding to something that the consumer is requesting from us, is answering the expectations, the needs of the consumer. And I must say that Ipsos has been a very good help to identify how we are serving those. And we also have the measurement with Ipsos about the reputation that is linked with how the consumer thinks about us, no? In comparison with the other CPGs. CPGs is a different animal in terms of evaluation, no? The CPG's business is very dynamic and very demanding, very aggressive in terms of the speed of the response of the consumer. Yeah. Loyalty is totally different, the definition of loyalty right now than in the past.
Yeah. And then, so I was going to come to you, Amanda. How does a payments category think about expectations, right? I expect that it works.
Right, I know, I was going to say.
I expect it goes through. I expect I'm going to get the bill.
I was going to say, when we talk about Coca-Cola or Entenmann's, like, that is such a conscious treat. Like, I'm in a great moment when I'm enjoying those things. But for a payments network, your expectation is that everything works and it's almost invisible, right? Like, your transaction went through, the business that you're paying at, they've got their money, and no bill. Cyber attacks, like, life is good, right? So there's a much bigger role to play there to educate consumers around the role that you're playing. I think expectations are different as well, because obviously we're serving such a wide swath of consumers. And so we spend a lot of energy getting to know everyone's situation and thinking about how we can help people in different situations, right? So folks who don't have credit cards, who are underserved, like, how can we help amplify them? How can we provide financial education, more access, more opportunities through open banking for loans to start small businesses, et cetera? That's very different expectations than someone who's using their reward points in their card to pay for an entire vacation. So it's really important for us to think about how are all these different groups behaving, but also how can we help empower them, and how can we make sure they realize, like, the trusted relationship that we can provide given their different situations. So I think it's kind of a mix between the empathy that you had as well. Yeah.
It's interesting that what we're responsible for is not simply the transaction or the product in this case, but it's all the things around it.
Exactly.
And our responsibility to the consumer, to the society, to the world.
Yep,
which
absolutely.
is great. So last one, I just want to touch briefly on empathy. Lindsay, I loved your example of the baby formula company where they created products so the mother could create a bottle with one hand. Tell me what Coca-Cola is doing in terms of empathy, and if there's any interesting, cool stories you have to tell.
Well, so I think in terms of stories, there's plenty, of course, but we are very much a brand marketing driven company. It's always been consumer first, and but there is a thread of keeping the brand promise, and that has different elements. And I think this is something that's not just for Coca-Cola, but any company really. There's a promise that you make to the consumer, and then you deliver on that promise by delivering either good product or great service, or a great transaction experience, I guess. All of those things line up. But in terms of empathy, I think one of the things that's very high on our agenda is that our product is also associated with, responsible water management, recycling. Is it good for the planet? I think next to the oil companies, we are the biggest, quote unquote polluters in the, so there's a aspect of purpose-driven business decisions that we need to kind of weave in order to get that. But it's not so much an active, act of kind of creating empathy, but it's with what we do, with essentially what we do with our World Without Waste initiatives, or the initiatives that we have for recycling water and more responsible usage, or reducing plastic in the content. So those are the cues, the branding cues that we have to almost successfully transmit in order to demonstrate empathy.
It's interesting, we did not intentionally go down a path talking about ESG. We're talking about how brands are built, but that through line is kind of coming through consistently across everything that I'm hearing. So one last question, I just want to go one by one. We've talked about expectations, we've talked about context, we've talked about empathy a little bit, and this is our new thinking on brand. What are we missing? Are we missing anything? Do you have other things that you're looking at that you're like, we need to enrich it with?
More than missing,
XYZ?
Oscar,
Sure.
I would like to reinforce something about empathy and how we are addressing empathy. I think that empathy, in our case, is changing our mindset in order to avoid the producer perspective, recognizing the consumer perspective, what the consumers say, what the consumer think, what the consumer does, and how we can be involved in that part. No? That is the empathy. Because if not, I could say I have a oven in which I can produce this kind of bread, and I'm going to deliver the bread that I can produce. But I need to do the bread that the consumer wants to have. And this is empathy, because we are responding to the request. And then communication and other activities. We have a lot of activities related with the consumer needs, even in the neighborhood in which our plants are located. Is be related with their request actively, not just selling the products and in arrogant way to say I have the best product. No, I have something that responds to their needs.
Yeah. Amanda, are we missing anything? Or there's anything that you're looking at from your perspective as a marketer?
I think trust is such an important word. And I think maybe it might be like a through line through some of those themes as well. But I think the repeated action of trust and having that reputable relationship with consumers, because the world's evolving, it's a volatile place, and you could be a very consistent brand and do one thing off mark and really piss off a lot of people and lose a lot of customers, and your stock goes down all in one day. And so I think trust is super important, and that shows character and consistency over time, and building that relationship with consumers. But I think it's like a through line to those things for sure. Yeah.
Good. What else is on your mind if we missed anything in this conversation?
No, I think it's. I didn't mention this earlier, but the whole aspect of brand promise and being, I guess, cognizant that consumers expect certain things from us. We are expected to respond with empathy and do that in the right context. That kind of brings us all together. I think it's a great way of looking at a set of is always in readiness.
Well, thank you, Luis Enrique. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Rajit, for your time today. It's been great to hear a perspective from practitioners who are dealing with this every day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really great. Thank you guys again for being here. I think we could have this conversation. We will continue it over cocktails. One of the things we think about was kind of in closing today, I loved a lot of the things you said about thinking about the need for constant innovation to really meet consumers' needs so that we remain relevant with all of the changing contexts. And that, again, like Oscar and I mentioned earlier, this is just kind of the start of the conversation to have this as a different lens and kind of layer for us to really understand what people need so that we can become even more relevant and help continue to fuel brand growth, corporate growth, and whether it's from products or services or different offerings that we can really look at and get under those consumer needs because they do evolve and they change, and context is really influencing that. So certainly it will continue to drive and evolve. We look forward to sharing more. We thank you all for being here with us today and hope that you'll use this time to kind of have a conversation starter, network, and hope to continue the conversation with you guys. And look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you for being here. And we'll be around to have any more further conversation. So thank you.